Welcome to today's broadcast of In Conversation with Dr. Sherry Cooper. We will be exploring the world of mortgages in Canada and why it's important to have a deep understanding of this topic. To guide us through this conversation, we're joined by Dr. Sherry Cooper. Dr. Cooper is a renowned economist, financial expert, and best-selling author with over 30 years of experience in the industry. She's also the chief economist at Dominion Lending Centres, Canada's largest mortgage company. In this episode, Dr. Cooper will provide us with valuable insights and expert analysis on the current state of the Canadian housing market, the impact of interest rates on mortgages, and the importance of working with a trusted mortgage advisor. We'll also delve into the services offered by Dominion Lending Centres and why they're an invaluable resource for anyone looking to purchase a home or invest in real estate in Canada. So whether you're a first-time homebuyer, a seasoned investor, or simply interested in the world of finance, this broadcast is sure to provide you with valuable information and insights that you won't want to miss. So sit back, relax, and join us as we dive into the fascinating world of mortgages with Dr. Sherry Cooper and your host, the president of Dominion Lending Centres, Eddy Cocciollo.
Well, all right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to ICW. Today was a good day. We had a 0.5% decrease in Sherry. I think the word of today might be jumbo,
right?
Which is exactly what we saw, exactly what you expected. I think you're 17 for 18 now in a row where you guessed where the rates are going. So good news. I mean, listen, if anything, it's the psyche of, the consumer. We really needed this half point, as you and I discussed over the last few weeks. We just needed it.
Right. I mean, psychology is everything in the housing market, and this will improve psychology. And I think we have another 125 basis points to go in terms of cuts.
We discussed maybe even another jumbo decrease in December. But before we get to your slides, a couple reminders. First of all, thank you, FCT, who's our sponsor today. If you do have questions, go ahead and type in your question. We will get to them at the end of Sherry's presentation. This way we can be smooth. We have lots to talk about. I mean, the U.S. election is coming. That's always a fun one. We also have some other really good news when it comes to policy changes that the government has. I know you have slides on those, so we'll get to those. But again, type in your questions. We'll get to them as soon as Sherry's done. Sherry, it's all yours.
Thank you. Well, Natasha, let's put these slides up. This is very good news. It was very much baked into the data. Once we saw that inflation came down to only 1.6% in September, and the fact that the economy in Canada still remains quite slow, it was obvious that the Bank of Canada needed to get rates down more quickly, because this is for sure a very restrictive monetary policy, even now with the overnight rate at 3.75%. So let's move to the next slide. I'm getting assistance from Natasha here because I can't click through. I don't even understand it, but whatever, it is what it is. This shows us that we have a soft landing in economic activity. You can see from this chart that the growth rate for 2024, I'm forecasting 1.1%. In parentheses, I put what the Bank of Canada is forecasting in today's monetary policy report. So we've got growth of 1.1% this year. They think only a touch stronger than that. 2025, I'm suggesting 1.8% growth. The bank is forecasting 2.1%. And then for 2026, 2.3%. Moving to the next slide, we see that on a quarterly basis, it was the third quarter of this year that we had much weaker data than what the bank was forecasting. I think when all of the numbers are released, which is still a couple of weeks away, the third quarter figure will be 1.3% growth, down from 2.1 in the second quarter. And the bank had been forecasting 2.8 for Q3. So they were way off the mark. And as the data came in and they discovered that the economy was much weaker than what they thought it would be, they began to telegraph to the markets that they could accelerate the pace of interest rate cuts. Moving on now, we see that Canadian per capita GDP is declining, but more importantly, it's little change from a decade ago. So more and more people have moved into the country, and despite that, we see that GDP is growing modestly, less than potential, which is the full employment level of GDP growth. But also, more importantly, per capita GDP, per capita consumer spending has been falling. And it's been falling now for 5 consecutive quarters. Next slide, please. So you see that in comparison to the United States, our per capita growth is much weaker, and our economy is just much more interest rate sensitive. And the next slide shows you that it's by definition the direct result of the fact that there is no such thing as a 30-year fixed rate mortgage in Canada. Not to mention that the mortgage interest in the United States is tax deductible. So you see that mortgage debt servicing as a percent of disposable income is much higher in Canada than in the US. So given that we've had massive rate increases because fighting inflation required it, but now, especially in Canada, it has taken its toll on the economy. And what we need to see is for interest rates to come down, I believe, another 125 basis points. So we've seen rates fall 125 basis points thus far, from 5% for the overnight policy rate to 3.75% right now. But I think it's headed for 2.5%. And it could even potentially go lower if the inflation numbers, as I suspect, remain at around 2%. Now, moving on to the labor markets, you see that Canada's September employment data improved considerably. If you move to the next slide, you can see that for September, we saw a big boost to the net change in employment, the strongest since April of last year. Another thing that was very surprising is shown in the next chart, which is that the unemployment rate has actually come down. Natasha, I need the next slide. Okay. When we look at the monthly improvement in employment for the last 12 months, it's averaged 26,000 net new jobs per month. But over that same 12-month period, the labor force growth averaged 125,000 new working age people living in Canada. And therefore, of course, we've seen with the decline in the vacancy rate of jobs that the hardest hit sector of the labor market has been the newcomers and youth. So it's the young newcomers whose unemployment rate has increased the sharpest. So it hasn't been felt in general by Canadians, but specifically, and in some sectors in particular, this has been a big problem. Now, moving forward, you see here that in September, the unemployment rate actually fell just 1/10 of 1 percentage point, but it fell to 6.5%. It's the first decline in the unemployment rate this year, but I believe that unemployment is headed for 7% as we move through 2025. As I've mentioned, the vacancy rates are way down. If you move to the next slide, please. And wage inflation does remain considerable. Now, it's off its peak, but wage inflation is still 4.6%. Much stronger, of course, than the 2% inflation target that the bank is aiming for. Next slide. Job vacancies have returned to pre-pandemic levels. As these vacancies declined, it had relatively little effect on the labor market because of the massive increase that we'd seen earlier in the year had increased the employment rate to probably the level that would stabilize. What the employment rate is the actual percentage of the working age population that has a job. So now that we are at a stage where we need to see additional net new jobs to bring the unemployment rate down, there's no option for the Bank of Canada but to continue to lower interest rates, especially as inflation is likely to remain low. Next slide. Rising unemployment, of course, always leads to an increase in mortgage delinquency rates, and this time is no exception. However, I just want to point out that mortgage arrears are still historically extremely low. So it's not a problem in terms of major delinquencies. Next slide. So as the job vacancies come down, so does inflation. And inflation is on a significant downward trend. If you move to the next slide, you can see inflation. The latest data for inflation in September showed inflation year over year for headline CPI was a mere 1.6%. Now remember, the target range is 1 to 3%. So really it's 2% that the bank is looking for. Now this number, move to the next slide, this number, incredibly low inflation, was biased downward by the decline in gasoline prices in September, reflecting the slowdown in the global economy. Next. This looks at the core inflation measures that the Bank of Canada deems to be the most appropriate. And in both cases, both the CPI trimmed and the CPI median, which are measures of overall inflation excluding the most volatile sectors. In both cases, the core inflation numbers have trended downward, and inflation for both is running at 2.3 to 2.4%. Next slide. Now, this looks at the 3-month moving average in those core measures of inflation. And by far, the largest component for inflation in Canada has been in shelter. The shelter component includes mortgage interest payments, renovations, and rent. And all of those components have been trending downward. So when you exclude the shelter component from core inflation, core inflation now is 1.8%, below the bank's target range. All of this giving comfort to the bank for a jumbo rate cut of 50 basis points. Next slide. So inflation is in a clear downward trend, and that is certainly likely to continue. Next slide. And you see that the breadth of inflation has also come down substantially. This shows you the proportion of sectors in the Canadian Consumer Price Index, the CPI, that is running above 3% inflation. And you see that only 38% of product prices are rising more than 3%. The biggest benefit in terms of inflation reduction has been in the goods sector, the consumption of goods. Manufacturing goods prices have come down. Even food inflation has come down substantially. And the good news is, with the Bank of Canada's easing, mortgage interest payments are also declining. So again, more proof that the Bank of Canada has been successful in breaking the back of inflation. Next slide. So there we go. The Bank of Canada had everything it needed to cut rates by a full 50 basis points, took the overnight rate down to 3.75%. But even at that level, monetary policy remains restrictive. I believe that we are going to see another 125 basis point rate cut, taking the policy rate down to 2.5% by the spring of 2025. In fact, many are forecasting, particularly realtors in the industry, that we'll see an uptick in housing market activity in the first quarter of next year. So those are the winter months. My view is the burst of activity will be seasonally, as always, in the spring session. Next slide. So this shows you the overnight rate coming down. And the reason I say that monetary policy remains very restrictive is because real rates, which are the nominal rates less the rate of inflation, continues to be very high. The overnight rate at 3.75% is still 145 basis points above current core CPI inflation. Now, the average over the last 30 years is a real rate of 60 basis points, not 145 basis points. So overnight rate is likely headed for 2.5%, and that will occur by the spring of next year. This compares, by the way, to 1.75% overnight rate prior to the pandemic. Next slide. So with the decline in the overnight rate, we will see, effective tomorrow, the prime rate coming down from 6.45% to 5.95%. And with another 125 basis points beyond this, we will see 470 possibly, maybe even lower for prime, which means that floating rate mortgage rates will come down. Next slide. This shows you the 5-year government bond yield. When the Bank of Canada met last time in September, this 5-year yield in Canada was at 2.78%. Now it's now just shy of 3%, so it's edged upward, but that's a US story, not a Canadian story. The US economy is showing considerable strength that has raised US short-term and long-term interest rates, and that always spills into Canada. Next slide. So this shows you what may well happen, even assuming that the next meeting, which is the last meeting this year on December 11th, will definitely get a 25 basis point rate cut. We could even see 50. Again, as the data come in, we'll look very closely at all the labor market data, of course, the inflation data, and the general economic data, the indicators that show us what GDP growth is doing. If those remain weak, we'll get a 50 basis point rate cut in December. But even without that, as we move into next year with 25 basis point rate reductions, we'll hit the 2.5% target sometime during the spring. And that, of course, will be very good news. And it's possible that we'll see even as low as a 2% overnight rate. But it's all data-driven, data-dependent. The Bank of Canada used the same language in its press release that it has used many times before. The last paragraph of the press release always says that each decision date by the governing council is independent of the one before and is data-driven based on the most recent information. So they also say that they're committed to achieving a sustainable level of inflation at their target rate of 2%. Next slide, please. This spring housing boom, and maybe boom is too strong a word, but certainly housing improvement is very much consistent with normal seasonal patterns. I wanted to show you this chart because we all know it, but I hadn't seen the actual numbers. And someone put this together for me. It's going back to 1980. It looks at the share of Canadian home sales in each month of the year. So you can see that it's the winter months that are the weakest, and they start to improve even into February, improving even more in March, April, peaking in May, remaining strong in June and July. So that's what we have to look forward to. And the Bank of Canada even said in their monetary policy report today that they expect to see home sales, home resales, which are existing home sales, as well as home prices rising as we move towards the first quarter and second quarter of next year. So good news for the industry. Next slide. So Canadian home sales, this has been a very dull period. We've seen Canadian home sales edge upward in September, but as the next chart shows you, it's still considerably below the 10-year moving average for sales. This chart shows you monthly home sales, and yes, it's edging upward, but still below the 10-year monthly average. The next slide shows you residential sales activity, and you see that in the third quarter of this year, it edged up just a bit. But hopefully we'll go back to maybe not to the boom that we saw in the early 2020s as a result of interest rates at rock bottom lows. The overnight rate was a mere 25 basis points once they finished easing monetary policy. We're not going back to 25 basis points, as I've said. The next slide shows you that new listings are surging. People are putting their homes on the market. In some cases, it's the direct result of potential changes in capital gains tax affecting the investor sector of the condo market, and as well the cottage sector. So the new listings numbers will likely continue to improve, which is great news for potential buyers. The next slide. This shows you that the sales to new listings are falling, though, because sales have not kept up with new listings. But again, the markets vary from region to region across Canada, but it's still relatively flat sales activity and flat home prices with rising inventories. So you see, sales have not increased to meet the new listings. The next slide looks at the benchmark price data on the MLS system. And there you see that year over year, prices remain flat, with prices falling in Toronto, Greater Toronto region, as well as the Greater Vancouver area. So for the largest cities in the country, home prices are flat to down. Calgary, Edmonton were stronger than average. Montreal, better than Toronto, but still not strong. Next slide. So let's talk about the recent changes in mortgage rules, and there's plenty of them. 40-year amortizations have been expanded to all first-time home buyers and all purchasers of newly built properties. So that raising the amortization from 25-year to 30-year, of course, means that keeps the lid on monthly payments and makes it easier for people to qualify. We've also seen the federal government has increased the $1 million price cap for insured mortgages to $1.5 million. TD Bank estimates that roughly 20% of housing in Canada is priced between $1 million and $1.5 million. So that's a significant proportion of the housing market. And as a direct result of these changes, it means that the required down payment is coming down. For example, for loan-to-value mortgages of greater than 80%, it requires a 5% down payment on the first $500,000 value of the home and 10% on the portion of the purchase price between $500,000 and now up to $1.5 million. And that substantially reduces, like, for example, for a home that sells at $1.25 million, the mandatory minimum down payment for insured mortgages has moved from what was $250,000 to about $100,000. Which is a very meaningful shift. The other changes that we've seen recently is lender switches are allowed without the federal mortgage stress test for all insured now and uninsured mortgages. This broadens it to the uninsured mortgages as well, and it may be extended to insurable mortgages in the future. And then finally, there's another bit that was introduced. I need to go back to the bottom of that slide. Insured refinancing now is going to be allowed to build up to 3 independent add-on units to already owner-occupied homes for long-term rental. So in other words, you can borrow at insured refinancing if you're doing it to adjust your home to be able to rent some portion of it, and not for Airbnb, but for longer term rentals. Now, the maximum loan to value for this would be 90%, 30-year amortization, and up to $2 million in total property value. So this is a mixed bag of federal changes to ease the housing affordability and to increase housing supply. Next slide. So now getting down to the specifics, mortgage originations, and will we see fixed or variable? The next slide shows you that the proportion of variable rate mortgage originations has plummeted from a record high of almost 60% of all mortgage originations down to a roughly 10%. So 90% of new mortgage borrowing is in the shorter term fixed rate loans, like 1 to 3 or 4 year fixed rate loans. But with all the cuts in interest rates going forward, that could well change. Next slide. This shows you the spread between fixed rate and variable rate mortgages, and that spread has narrowed considerably. And then that's the first chart here. And on the second chart, you see that each time the Bank of Canada cuts rates, it adds fuel to real estate demand, but it also makes variable rate mortgages look more attractive. So right now it's the 1 year mortgage that, or the 5-year mortgage rate fixed is lower than the variable. But as we move further along the curve, meaning in time, that's going to flip when it will be that variable rates become cheaper than fixed, and that will improve the flow of mortgage originations into that sector of the mortgage market. Next slide. Now, we've long talked about this payment shock, as 70% of Canadian mortgages would come up for renewal between the beginning of this year and through 2026. With these kinds of rate cuts, if I'm right about them, the mortgage cliff that we'd all been expecting that would be really disastrous for personal disposable income is not likely to be as big a problem as we thought, and largely the direct result of lower interest rates. We will see that as people move into 2025 and 2026 and renew their mortgages, they will not see an increase in monthly payments, or certainly not as large an increase as we might have thought earlier in the cycle. Next slide. So finally, let me wrap this up with some of the demographic issues that are so important for housing and the housing shortage that we're very much experiencing. Now, immigration has been the major factor that has increased demand for housing of all sorts, whether for rent, for purchase, as well as boosting overall economic activity. But it's made housing very unaffordable in most city centers. Next slide. You can see the Canadian population. I mean, I have to keep showing you this slide because it's just so incredible. At 3.2% population growth year over year, this is much stronger than any other OECD country. This is the kind of population growth you see in some of the smaller countries in Africa. So it sure isn't because the Canadian fertility rate has gone up. It actually remains at less than 2 children on average per woman. In fact, it's at around 1.4 children on average per woman. So this surge has primarily been in temporary foreign workers or foreign students. The next slide shows you that when it comes to the planned permanent immigration, the government is sticking with its target next year of 500,000 new workers. But that number is dwarfed by the influx of foreign students and temporary workers hoping ultimately to get permanent residency. Next slide. Now, the government plans to cut the influx of temporary residents, but the next chart shows you that the Bank of Canada is not so sure about that. The Bank of Canada forecasts 3.3% population growth this year and revised up federal estimates of non-permanent resident inflows. Now, just today, it was announced that in order to hire foreign workers, temporary workers, now you have to pay minimum wage. And so again, that's an attempt to slow the influx of temporary workers because of the pressures it's been placing on the housing market. Next slide. But we need temporary workers. We need about 100,000 new, trained, experienced construction workers. Most of these people will be temporary foreign workers hoping to become citizens. We can't possibly meet the needs of home building that's essential to indeed improve affordability without the influx of these workers. So it's a catch-22 for the federal government. Next slide. So the housing shortage. The next slide shows you just how serious this housing shortage is. The two lines, the blue line is Canadian population growth, and the red line is housing completions. And you see that it would take 500,000 housing completions per year to meet the surge in housing demand. And we've never seen numbers even half that big in any single year. And not to mention there are shortages of land around most of our cities and lots of political mumbo jumbo about all of this. Every level of government is on side to increase home building, but we still have enormous lags in the development process, the approval processes. It takes more than 2 years between the plan to develop a particular property and the actual, first shovel in the ground. Next slide. This shows you that most of the building that has occurred in Canada has been in the multifamily space, and that single family permits, these are housing permits, so they're leading indicators of home completions. The single family sector is very, very small, and the government is encouraging that the multifamily construction be along the public transportation lines so as not to increase traffic congestion any more than it already is. Next slide. So the housing starts figures are woefully inadequate. These are the actual numbers, and you see that right now we see the same level of housing starts in Canada as in the late 1970s, when the population was roughly half the level we have today. So we are not meeting the new demand for housing, and the housing shortage, unfortunately, even with easing monetary policy, lower interest rates, therefore potentially more building, because the developers and construction people need to pay interest on their loans as well. All of the rate cuts are positive, but we're going to have continued housing shortages for the foreseeable future. Next slide. So that wraps up my formal presentation, Eddie. I'm happy to open this up now for questions, comments.
Yeah, thanks, Sherry. Lots to unpack. Many conversations need to be had with all sorts of clients, be it you're renewing, coming up for renewal, lots of questions about, where should you be? Should it be a variable rate? Should it be a fixed rate? Should it be short-term fixed? those conversations. And then, of course, refis. You know, do you have equity in your home? Do you need to refinance? And then, of course, purchasing. When's the best time? Pre-approvals are so important. Even though we're headed for a rate decrease, you still need to have a pre-approval to ensure that when you're entering the market, you're doing it from a position of power. And then finally, investors. Where are the investors in all this, right? They have sort of been on the sideline for a while, but I think there's opportunities to come back in. As you said, price increases with all the new government changes coming. There's going to definitely be, a swath of purchases that are going to happen with people that are on the fence. So if you have those conversations, really important you have it with a mortgage professional. DLC has on the ready for having those conversations. You can visit www.dominionlending.ca, find a mortgage professional near you, and sit down and have those conversations. Sherry, so let's start with I think the GDP, because I thought it was really interesting that you mentioned that the GDP numbers in the gap of the U.S. was so large, and it's and I think in your chart it's never been that big. So what are the consequences of having that gap? So you mentioned the bond rates and how the U.S. continues on having a robust economy, which is holding our bond rates to a level, that's not going to probably come down for a while if the economy keeps going. So is there, what about trade and other factors? What is going to happen, if that gap continues?
Well, we've seen it happen already. The Canadian dollar is down to 72 cents. And that's where you feel it the most in terms of relative performance in Canada versus the US. Both countries' stock markets are near or at record highs, so that's been good. Canada needs to do what it's doing. I mean, inflation, as long as inflation stays around 2%, it's really important that we do see an easing in monetary policy so that we don't push the economy into recession. And I don't think we will. I think that we're going to have a soft landing this time, which is incredible. And the other thing that's been a positive for Canada is with the opening of the East-West pipeline, we've seen our export growth really step up, and that would be energy exports to the United States mainly, but also potentially to the Far East, China, for example, as oil now can be transported to the deep sea ports of British Columbia and then on to Asia.
Okay, we're gonna get to the question in a second. I have one more question. Deflation, is that a possibility? And if it is, what will that do to our economy?
Well, in the 10 years prior to the pandemic, inflation averaged less than 2%. And in some sectors, there was considerable deflation, prices in technology, for example. But globalization was a major factor there, where companies began to produce in China and Taiwan and Vietnam, et cetera, to reduce labor costs. That took prices down. Now, the reverse happened because of the pandemic. Now they're bringing semiconductor manufacturing back to the US, or actually it's going mainly to Mexico. But it's still closer to home, but wage costs will be higher, and therefore the price pressures will be considerable. And that gets me to the subject of trade in general, which is one big component of the election debates right now as we enter the last 10 days, 11 days of before the actual election. Although people are voting right now in person in the US. Trump has talked a lot about tariffs. He's hearkening back to the McKinley administration, which occurred in the 1890s. That was the Gilded Age, by the way. You know, Carnegie making all that money. And the economics profession debunked in early 1900s the notion that a country can protect itself from competition and therefore prosper with a great big tariff wall. Firstly, tariffs always end up being a competitive battle country to country. We put tariffs on Canada, or the US puts tariffs on Canada. Canada's going to put tariffs on the US. And it just shrinks the economic pie worldwide.
Yeah.
It also increases prices because a tariff, like 100% tariff, doubles the price of the product. Tariffs are not paid by foreign countries. Tariffs are paid by domestic consumers. So, and it's a regressive tax on consumers because it clearly is a larger proportion of your total spending and income, the poorer you are. So it's just a bad idea all around.
Yeah, and I want to get back to the U.S. election. I want to get to some questions before we only have 6 minutes left. So let's get to those questions. Jason Nugent asks, how worried are they, Bank of Canada, that they're accelerated the drops? So are they worried? Like they're sitting there going, okay, we've got to do these jumbo loans because it's really, but are they worried about the future of those drops, or are they comfortable? I think that's.
Well, no, they seem to suggest that they need to get rates down. And they need to get rates down in a hurry. And they even in the monetary policy report and the policy statement, they delineated their expectation that housing markets are going to improve considerably in coming months as a direct result of the rate cuts. And they didn't say it as this could be a potential mitigating factor for rate cuts. They said it as though it were a very positive thing, because they also believe that it will increase construction spending as well.
Right. Okay, Pete asks, why does Bank Canada insist on including housing costs in the CPI? It's one of the only couple of central banks that do this. So other central banks don't include housing costs. Does this end up over-inflating the CPI number and thus overshooting the tightening measures?
Well, it does, but everybody looks at the core inflation excluding shelter. So we know that it's kind of self-generated inflation. They're not going to take the mortgage interest out of the CPI. What they will do, they're calling it super core in the US. They're calculating their core inflation less shelter as super core, and that level of inflation is well below 2%.
Okay. Faisal asks, do you think banks will follow the same drop in prime? So historically, I don't know if people know, they don't actually go like hand in hand or exact. Sometimes if it's a quarter, they'll go 15 basis points, or if it's a half, 35 basis. They've done that in the past. Do you feel like that's necessary, or will they match?
I think they'll be close to matching. There may be one or two laggards, but competitive pressures in the housing market and mortgage market is very intense.
Yeah, absolutely. So, hey, Monique. Monique asks, thank you so much. My question is specific to OSFI announcements to eliminate stress tests for uninsured mortgage switches. There seems to be a belief that it'll be free of all renewal clients. When is the actual fact they'll still have the reassessed by the new lender taking the renewal? Any idea when more information will be available? Do you have any idea?
No, not directly, and there's still lots of questions to be answered, and we haven't heard the details. But no, I mean, just because you don't have to stress test it 200 basis points above the contract rate doesn't mean that you don't have to qualify for the loan.
Yeah. Okay, and then Seem asks, is it fair to say that housing starts globally is a problem and not just unique in Canada? I don't know the answer to that, Seem. Do you?
Well, everyone's talking about unaffordable housing, and certainly in the G7. But there's unaffordable and then there's unaffordable. And because of the structure of our mortgage market, there's no question that Canadian housing and the Canadian economy generally, as I've said earlier, is very interest sensitive compared to the US. The UK has a similar system to Canada. Australia and New Zealand, yes, they have housing shortages. There are housing shortages around the world, but most specifically in countries that have opened the doors to immigration. And there's no question that since 2015, our doors have been wide open. And while we allowed, millions of people in, we didn't step up home construction for those people to find a place to live that they can afford to live in.
You and I talked about the capital gains tax that the government talked about, but we don't know if that's actually gone through. Has it gone through? And if it hasn't, what's the next step?
Well, my accountant tells me that the legislation hasn't passed. So technically it hasn't gone through. However, and if come the end of the year when all of us are filing our taxes, the Trudeau government is still in place, my guess is that the capital gains tax increase is going to be enforced. But should his government come down between now and then, I don't know that if we had a conservative government, if they would push forward with the capital gains tax increase. They say they won't,
right?
But who knows?
So we're going to go a few minutes later, guys, because we started a little later. So bear with us. Hopefully you can stick around. Phil McDowell has asked you a question about the influence of per capita GDP comparing the US and Canada due to unknown numbers of unregistered aliens within. So is there, like, do they factor that in, or because you can't count them because you don't know they're there, there's no
question that the US does have immigrants that are not publicly signing up for Social Security, or they don't want their existence to be highlighted.
Yeah.
So, but there is also no question that when mortgage interest is tax deductible and property taxes are tax deductible, at least to some limit in the US, that does make housing more affordable, no question. And also home prices aren't nearly as high as in Canada on average. So the US just is less interest sensitive, and that's a fact. Also, the US has had a lot of fiscal stimulus, more than we have, with Biden's initiatives to improve infrastructure, get inflation down, help families, help eliminate some of the student debt. Lots of very stimulative policies, which will or won't change depending on the results of the election.
So many of us know you're American. Obviously, the U.S. election coming up in the next 10 or 11 days is going to be influential on what happens in Canada. I know there's a lot of tariff talk that you just mentioned, middle class tax. There's a lot going on over there. What are your thoughts around a Trump win versus a Kamala win? Is that going to be better, worse for Canadians? Where do you see that? And how does that play?
Well, people have gone through their long list of promises for both candidates and have concluded that Kamala Harris is better for the economy. Now, of course, the Republicans wouldn't agree with that, but that's basically the result, even of conservative think tanks like the American Enterprise Institute released a report this morning saying that the Trump tariffs would have a contractionary impact on the US economy, and it could add to inflation considerably. And then did the same thing looking at the Harris proposals. Now, everyone knows, though, that what they propose during an election period bears little resemblance to what actually happens in the following 4 years. But nevertheless, it's going to make a huge difference. And everyone knows that Donald Trump has been the most extraordinary president, let alone presidential candidate, we've ever seen. And I mean, not just in my lifetime, but like in anybody's lifetime. Since the beginning of the United States, we've never had this kind of rhetoric, at least. And I mean, I'm biased. I am a dual citizen, and I do live in, I'm a resident of Canada. But I think Donald Trump's dangerous.
Sean Humphreys just mentioned that it's not economists that vote for Trump. Tariffs sound like a great idea to the Trump base, and obviously, that country split right down the middle. I mean, it's amazing how year after year, election after election, you see that split, and it's just a matter of that middle that makes the difference. It's incredible.
It is. In fact, you could just throw out all the like all the states that are one way or the other, and just have an election in the 5 or 6
states, that go back and forth. Yeah, for sure.
Really.
Yeah. So let's just talk about the next rate announcement, because I think that's important. You mentioned that there's a possibility for another jumbo cut. You also talked about it in the spring being down to 2.5. Some economists are going more aggressive. You even mentioned today that it could go down 2%. It's all going to depend on, of course, the data that comes through on different factors. Do you feel like if it does come down quickly and gets down to that level by April, and with the shortage of housing, the crisis, we're going to get back to that period of multiple offers and people fighting over houses? How does that play a factor in all of this? Will there be enough inventory? Like, we're seeing inventory rise, which is great news. It's like you said, gives a buyer more choice, and it's a buyer's market, which I think is good for, obviously not the seller, but good for everybody else. What are your thoughts on if it goes down that quickly? What is it going to do to housing?
Oh, I think it's going to be positive, but it's not going down to 25 basis points. Like we have in our recent memory, the booming housing market of the early pandemic period. That's not coming back, because they're never going to take rates down to those levels.
Never say never. I've learned that.
Never say never, and we could have another pandemic, God forbid. But really, I mean, likelihood is we're not going to get the frenzied activity with a shortage of inventory and multiple bids where people, would be in multiple bidding situations for dozens of properties and not getting a single one. I mean, that's not likely to happen. But it is, no question, we'll see a burst of activity in the spring, but would it, will it be a bubble? Will we start talking about, massive changes in tightening credit? No.
A balanced market is always a good market. So on that note, thanks, Sherry. Always insightful. Really appreciate you. Thank you, FCT, for your continued support and sponsorship. All of you that tune in every Bank of Canada announcement. The next one is, and I know Natasha's going to shine it up, there it is, December 11th, where we're at this moment predicting another jumbo cut. But just a reminder, if you need that advice, please contact one of our mortgage professionals at dominionlending.ca. They will help you and guide you through. Thank you, everyone. Until next time, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.